Welcome to the Mind
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness,
Originals are nonconformists.
creativity,
People who not only have new ideas,
intelligence,
they're the people you want to bet on.
in childhood,
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
and beyond. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Welcome to episode 20. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. We're about to take a look into the nuts and bolts of IQ testing and the changing standards for identifying gifted and talented kids. If you're a policy nerd or a psychologist, a psych examiner, or maybe you're a parent or a teacher who feels like you have kids who've fallen through the cracks, this episode is definitely for you. It's also a really good refresher on the history of identifying giftedness, and a first look at the new policy paper from the National Association for Gifted Children on IQ testing best practices for identification of gifted and talented kids. Speaking of NAGC, we're looking forward to the national conference in November in Minneapolis. We will put a link in the show description on our website if you're curious about attending. We will be there and will be providing special coverage from the conference. It's also a great idea to follow us on social media for updates on this and other events related to matters of the mind. We're on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod and on Facebook and Instagram at Mind Matters Podcast. We're honored to have Dr. Linda Silverman alongside us today. She's an educational psychologist and she founded and directs the Gifted Development Center in Colorado. Linda's been studying the psychology and education of the gifted since 1961. She's written over 300 articles, chapters, and books, including a chapter on assessment of giftedness in the recently released volume, Handbook of Giftedness in Children. She's a real policy wonk in the area of gifted assessment and education, and she will join us next on the Mind Matters podcast.
On a recent episode of Mind Matters,
Debbie Reber joins us today. Tell us a little bit about Tilt Parenting.
I created it to be kind of an online resource, an online home for parents who are raising what I call differently wired kids, being on the spectrum or having ADHD or being gifted or anxiety or sensory issues, learning differences.
Part of parenting a differently wired child is meeting them where they are, not just where you want them to be or where their neurotypical peers are.
We're in the best position to support these kids, but in order to do that, we need to deal with our own issues. We need to get clear on where we're stuck in our thinking about what's possible for our kids and who they are. And we need to figure out how to really embrace them. Then we don't have to feel so attached to the outcome or it looking a certain way. And we can really celebrate and embrace who our child is.
that's episode 15, available at mindmatterspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Linda Silverman. I direct Gifted Development Center and the Institute for the Study of Advanced Development in Denver, Colorado. And I'm passionate about the gifted and twice exceptional.
We're going to pull back the curtain a little on IQ testing and on the shifting opinions about using IQ alone to identify gifted and talented kids. There's new data that is driving a change in policy from the NAGC. It's possible to spend hours or even days on this subject, so the goal is to narrow it down just a little. Let's talk about the new policy paper from NAGC, but for the newbie or the casual listener, refresh us on IQ.
IQ tests were developed to measure abstract reasoning. Abstract reasoning is what differentiates the gifted from the rest of the population. And there are different levels of abstract reasoning. Just like at the other end of the spectrum, there are children who are mildly intellectually disabled, moderately, severely, profoundly. There are children at the other end of the spectrum that are mildly, moderately, highly, exceptionally, and profoundly gifted. Each of those standard deviations is a different level of functioning in terms of abstract reasoning capacity. So that was the original reason why IQ tests were developed. They've gotten a lot of bad publicity. A lot of people rankle at the thought of IQ testing, but there are things that people are not aware of. One is that without IQ testing, we never would have found gifted girls. They were demonstrated through IQ tests. Up until the IQ test was developed, we thought about giftedness as eminence, and females didn't have the same opportunity to gain eminence. So it wasn't until we actually tested abstract reasoning that we found that there's an equal number of gifted girls as there are gifted boys. In the field of learning disabilities, the IQ test is absolutely indispensable because it takes a look at the child's strengths in abstract reasoning and compares them to their weaknesses in working memory, their weaknesses in processing speed, their weaknesses in items that are presented auditorily, their weaknesses in items presented visually, their weaknesses in eye-hand coordination. So when you suspect that you might have a child that is dyslexic or dysgraphic, or a child who hates writing is a child who might be dysgraphic, a child who might have ADHD, who has difficulty sitting still. The first thing that is done is an IQ test to try to determine specifically the cause of the issue. When you have a twice exceptional child, IQ testing is really the only way you can find out what you've got. It tells you both how gifted the child is and what the specific learning disabilities are. But there's a caveat. Because giftedness covers up learning disabilities, because you can use compensation to answer questions. If your eyes don't work well together, your abstract reasoning can fill in what your eyes can't see. And because your learning disabilities can pull down your IQ score, it's very important to interpret the strengths and weaknesses separately when you're looking at twice exceptional children. If you put them all together, you'll miss both the giftedness and the learning disability, and you won't recognize twice exceptionality.
I think one of the things that you hit on that I find so important is understanding that compensation that gifted kids are able to do, and that's part of what makes the struggles that they have so difficult to see. You know, as we're talking about identifying gifted learners, I know that process has changed a lot over the years. What are some of the most significant changes that you've seen, for better or for worse, as that process has evolved?
In the early days of testing, you got a global IQ score. And a lot of people rankled at that idea because they said, well, you know, you can't be gifted in everything, and these tests are highly verbal, and it's not fair to populations that are more visual, or who have English as a second language, or who didn't have as many books in the home. So David Wexler, developed a two-part IQ test that had a verbal section and what he called a performance section, which was predominantly nonverbal. And then there was a full-scale IQ score that was derived from those two scores. But when he added the nonverbal dimension during, I think it was World War I might be wrong about which war it was, but it enabled more individuals to serve in the armed forces who couldn't qualify because the United States was a melting pot of many different cultures and language backgrounds. And the IQ test before David Wexler was much too verbal for immigrants. So the nonverbal section became very important. However, David Wexler always believed that it isn't two different types of giftedness or types of intelligence that you're looking at. He believed that those are just different probes into a unified concept of intelligence. So even though he had, counting the full scale, 3 different measures that were derived from his early tests, he still believed in a global score. Now, after he left the planet, those who followed him were more concerned in the factor scores than they were in global scores. And so instead of 2 factors, now we had 4 factors. And there were 4 factors in the WISC-4 and 4 factors in the WAIS-4, the Wexler Adult Scale. The WISC is the Wexler Intelligence Scale for Children. So we're now on the 5th revision of the WISC, and that's the most popular IQ test. But now, both the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale, which started out having only one global score, and the Wechsler Intelligence Scales, the WIPC-4, the WISC-5, and the new WACE-5 that's coming out, are 5-factor intelligence scales.
It seems antithetical, but with factors, more doesn't mean better. Tell us why that is.
The more factors you add to the measurement of intelligence, the less real is your full-scale IQ score. It cannot be a unitary construct when it's made up of 5 factors. So for a child to get into a gifted program using a full-scale IQ score, they have to be good at everything. They have to be good with everything presented verbally. They have to be good with everything presented visually. They have to be good with timing. They have to be good with eye-hand coordination. That is a completely unrealistic expectation for all gifted children, but it is tremendously punitive to twice exceptional children. So in the chapter that I published recently in the Handbook of Giftedness in Children, it's called Assessment of Giftedness. I argue strongly for the demise of the full-scale IQ score. I feel like it's no longer relevant and it should not be used to prevent qualified children with high abstract reasoning from getting services because of weak working memory or weak processing speed, maybe visual processing issues, because the WISC-5 is a very visual test. So I've been extremely vocal about the need to do away with the full-scale IQ score.
The National Association for Gifted Children has just released a new position statement on IQ testing. It says that a full-scale IQ test is not the best indication of giftedness, citing this research that Linda was a part of. The statement says that there are new composite scores that are not yet in the manual, and so most examiners aren't aware of them, but they need to know about them. These composite scores, or expanded scores, are much better for evaluating gifted children and are now available on the Pearson website. Pearson is the company that participates in the design of IQ tests, specifically the Wechsler test that we'll talk about today. In NAGC's new statement, they recommend that examiners go to the Pearson website and see technical reports 1 and 5. This refers to some of the new composites, and it's a pretty major position shift in the area of gifted evaluation because it recommends that we stop using processing speed as a component to determine eligibility for gifted programs. So, how did they arrive at that position?
We studied 390 gifted children from all over the United States, and their processing speed score was 106, which is in the average range. But processing speed is included in the full-scale score. So one of the main points is inclusion of processing speed scores hinders gifted identification. And then we have a whole list of recommended expanded scores or ancillary scores that are available either in the test manual or on the Pearson website that should be used to test gifted children, and especially for twice exceptional. Here's the main problem. The expanded scores require testers to give supplementary subtests that they don't usually give. You can get the full-scale IQ score with only 7 subtests. And some school districts who feel that they're strapped for funds say, okay, only administer these 7 subtests. The test manual really strongly urges you to give 10 subtests because then you can get all 5 of the factor scores, and you can't do that with just 7 because there are some that you would only have 1 subtest for. So most testers around the world are giving 10 subtests, but to do these expanded scores, they have to give 13. And they don't know that they need to give 13. Unless they happen to have heard your podcast or read the NAGC position statement or in some other way been exposed to the needs of the gifted community. To a great extent, these new expanded scores were developed with the gifted in mind.
So you went and took these students who had already been identified as gifted and then administered the IQ test to them again to develop these composite scores. How did that process begin and lead to that analysis of those scores?
Bobby Gilman and I probably did the most advocating for the expanded scores. And we had regular conversations with Susie Rayford, who is the test constructor of the WISC-5, the WACE-5, the WIPSI-4. And she listened to us and participated in our assessment special interest group. So Susie developed the verbal expanded crystallized index and the expanded fluid index based on the norms and the studies that they had done through Pearson. Those two were developed by Pearson Assessment based on conversations that Susie Rayford had with Bobby Gilman and myself about what gifted children need in an IQ test. Then there is a new expanded index. It's the Expanded General Ability Index, and that was one that I developed. I called it the Gifted Index, and it came to me almost 2 years ago in a vision. It was November 19th, 2016. I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I saw how gifted children could be identified. And it required 8 subtests, and 5 of them were regular core subtests that all psychologists give, and 3 of them were supplementary tests that most psychologists don't give. So I sent my idea to Susie Rayford at Pearson and asked her what she thought of it. By March of 2017, Susie had developed norms for the Gifted Index, and she called it the Expanded General Ability Index because it's the 5 factors that make up the General Ability Index plus 3 supplementary. And she's able to get expanded scores accepted by Pearson, where a gifted index might have been a bigger struggle to get through. So that's the term that's being used. It's called the EGAI. And the research that we began from the minute she sent us the norms, we did research here at Gifted Development Center, and Dee Levecki did research at Providence, Rhode Island. She has Gifted Resource Center of New England. And Susie Rayford and I presented the data and compared them with Pearson's findings. This is all in technical report number 1. She has tremendous amount of data for the Verbal Expanded Crystallized Index, which is called the VECI. That turns out to be the very best index for finding gifted children. And in the research we did with 390 children from 7 sites, that the data were collected through our assessment special interest group at NAGC. A lot of it came from Summit Center in California. Sylvia Rim sent quite a bit of data. We have data from New York, data from Dee Levecki. There are several different people involved in collecting the data. And the second best measure of giftedness was my gifted index, the Expanded General Ability Index. Now, the norms have not been published yet. Susie Rayford is in the middle of devising the technical report that will include the norms for the EGAI. So at this moment in time, that's not something that people will be able to do. They can collect the data on it, but they can't actually find out what the score is until that's released, and it should be released in the next few months.
So what if someone's scheduled to be tested soon, before the norms for the Expanded Gifted Ability Index are released? They recommend examiners go ahead and administer the other subtests that can be combined when the norms are announced, right? So which ones are those?
Administer arithmetic, which is a supplemental test, comprehension, and I think it's information. That's the other one.
It is, yeah.
Similarities of vocabulary everybody gives. Information and comprehension and arithmetic are the 3 supplemental tests that they have to add to the battery. And then block design, matrix reasoning, and figure weights everybody gives. So if they can get their examiner to administer those 3 additional subtests, they can immediately get the verbal expanded crystallized index, which we're finding has the highest scores for all of the samples, well into the gifted range. Even when nothing else comes out gifted, the VECI comes out gifted. And it's very important because if the child scores high enough, the Davidson Institute accepts the VECI for qualification for Davidson Young Scholars. So even if the expanded general ability index isn't out yet, they still should have the tester derive the VECI from technical report number 1 on the Pearson website. Then very soon they'll be able to get that second score, which is the expanded general ability index. But there are other composite scores that are not well known and that should be derived by testers. And they're very important for gifted kids who have different types of constellations of abilities. There's a nonverbal index, an expanded fluid index, the general ability index, and the quantitative reasoning index.
So this puts you a little at odds with Pearson, since they appear to be confident in the viability of the full-scale IQ score to determine giftedness. Is that a fair thing to say?
My point is, no child should ever be disqualified from gifted services based on a full-scale IQ score, which may be a questionable measure. It may not be a unitary construct if the composite scores that make it up are too different from each other. And a rule of thumb for what is too different is 23 points. If the composite scores vary by 23 points, then your full-scale IQ score is uninterpretable. And most people do not know this. The examiners, the educators, the people who are using IQ scores to make either legislative decisions or selective decisions in school districts have no idea that they're trying to put together apples and oranges and they're coming up with applesauce that it doesn't, even taste like applesauce, because the measures are measuring such different things and the scores are too different from each other to be averaged.
What other benefits do you see of using these alternative scores to qualify for gifted education services?
Culturally diverse children are unduly penalized by full-scale IQ scores. Children who have English as a second language are unduly penalized. Children who have a more visual spatial learning style. That's an idea I came up with many years ago, the visual spatial learner. They're not going to do well on time tests. They're not going to do well in some of them on strongly auditory tests. And they're very definitely going to be getting lower scores on processing speed. But given the low scores that we got on 390 kids from all over the United States, some of them from just trying to get into regular gifted programs, I feel like all gifted kids are penalized when processing speed is included in their full-scale IQ.
Many schools in this area and elsewhere use the WASI, which is an abbreviated version of the Wechsler scale, to identify kids for gifted services. What are your thoughts on the WASI as compared to the other options we're talking about?
Well, any of these short forms are what I call screening tools. And you would never even dream of using a WASI to get children qualified for services for intellectual disability. You'd be in court within a day. But we think that we can give the COGAT and the WASI and the Naglieri nonverbal ability test because it's inexpensive, and that's going to be good enough for gifted. And it is not. A screener is not a way of finding gifted kids. It's a way of determining who's likely to do well on a comprehensive measure. So I am not in favor of any of these being used, but where they cannot be used is with twice exceptional children. If that is how a program determines giftedness, twice exceptional children will be discriminated against.
This is a phenomenon we actually see often. The big picture reveals the flaws. And then there's the confidence interval that says that if we were to retest a child, their score would fall within a range of scores, not necessarily that particular number. But Linda, and indeed many in the field, feel data and scores alone aren't enough.
We need to stop relying on numbers alone to make decisions about children's needs. The selection of gifted students should be taken as seriously, in my estimation, as the selection of any other special needs population. It takes a committee. It takes a full evaluation with a full IQ test, not some little screening device, not a Snellen chart for giftedness. It's a decision that should be made on the basis of need, not trying to do a numbers game and a matrix and letting that be the deciding factor. The decision needs to be subjective. You are making decisions about people's lives. And when you make decisions about people's lives, it takes people's judgment. Numbers don't make judgments. People do. And I do not think hard and fast anything is appropriate for the selection of gifted children at any time.
An examiner has to know when to stop asking questions. Obviously, that's usually when the examinee stops being able to answer the questions, but how many can they miss before the examiner moves on? This is known as the discontinue criteria.
We've been told that you cannot derive a standard IQ score without the discontinue criteria. And the discontinue criteria truly are unfair. It makes most clinical sense to test the limits of the child's ability by giving them a standard score with the discontinue criteria and then continuing to offer items after they've reached the discontinue criterion to see just how many additional items they can answer, and even write in the report, in the narrative, had the child been given credit beyond this very short discontinue criterion, the IQ score would have been, or the composite score would have been, or the subtest score would have been. You write that in the narrative. We have even talked to test constructors in the past about having two different sets of discontinue criteria, one for the average population and one for the gifted, because we've seen children who got 6 extra points on matrix reasoning, 6 extra items correct, after they missed 2 in a row and for matrix reasoning, and they were supposed to stop. So the discontinue criteria are really a problem.
Give us a little history on how the discontinue criteria has changed. Is it being lowered to save time or money, or has it always been too low, in your opinion?
The original IQ test, the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale that was developed by Lewis Terman, the discontinue criteria were just no issue. You could show a child a vocabulary card, and they could define as many words as they were capable of, even if they were at the top. And the same was true with any item that they could solve at a much higher level. They were given credit for everything that they could do correctly after they reached the ceiling of the test. That's how I think a test should be constructed for gifted kids. But because we're trying to make tests fast, so that we can get them in schools and be able to pay less for psychological services and test more kids in less time, we've cut the discontinued criteria down from a really reasonable set. You know, if you can't answer the next 5 questions, for example, then we stop asking you questions. We assume you can't answer any. But now it's only 2 or 3 questions. While most of the testing industry has gone in the direction of relentlessly shortening discontinue criteria, have the test take less time and be less boring or frustrating for an average child. One test constructor went in the opposite direction, and that was Cecil Reynolds. And some listeners may be using the Reynolds Intellectual Assessment Scales, the RIAS, for finding children for programs. We have a program here called Hope Academy, and that serves, it's preschool and kindergarten for low-income, culturally diverse students. And we have been giving the RIST, which is a short form of the RIAS, for children to get into that program. We were finding that with missing 2 consecutive items, children who belonged in the program were not qualifying for it. So we continued to offer items beyond that. And one child who got a 119, the score jumped to 156 when you continued to offer items. And another child went from 118 to 153. And the head of the school, the principal, said those children were doing beautifully in the school. And so she gave her permission for us to ignore the discontinue criteria and just keep giving items to the child and giving them credit for any they could answer. And because we shared that with Cecil Reynolds, he was so impressed with it that when his new RIAS came out, he actually went in the opposite direction. Instead of having 2 discontinue items, now you have to miss 3 in a row before you discontinue. And I certainly hope that other test constructors follow suit, because discontinue criteria really are a problem, especially for twice exceptional children whose information is somewhat spotty.
So let's say we have a room full of decision makers, stakeholders, parents, teachers, and counselors. What would you tell them?
I want people to understand that IQ testing is important and that a comprehensive IQ test is not the same as a group test or a short form. That when you're making decisions that we call high-stakes decisions, it's important to use comprehensive assessment tools. Incorporate qualitative information in our decision about who receives gifted services. Teachers see gifted behaviors. Parents see a child doing things that are very unusual. The child goes through the developmental milestones at an incredibly rapid rate. And all of these things have to take precedence over the scores themselves. Qualitative information has to inform our decision about who gets into a gifted program. We cannot rely simply on numbers.
Dr. Linda Silverman, founder of the Gifted Development Center in Colorado, thank you so much for spending time with us.
I enjoyed it immensely.
Still more to come. Stay right here.
The Mind Matters podcast recognizes organizations who help gifted children thrive. One of these organizations is the National Association for Gifted Children. NAGC supports those who enhance the growth and development of gifted and talented children through education, advocacy, community building, and research. We invite you to visit giftednessknowsnoboundaries.org and join NAGC's movement to see, understand, teach, and challenge gifted and talented children from all backgrounds. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
When we work with children and families and make decisions about educational placement, we are making decisions that have a large impact on their lives. To reduce their abilities and talents and motivations to just a single number seems too basic to capture the true needs of a child. Some people who are unfamiliar with the process of assessing intelligence and what exactly it measures may even question the validity of using an IQ score at all. Historically, though, the background of assessing for giftedness has been well documented, and it's a valuable tool in this process. As we learn more about the way the brains of our neurodiverse gifted learners work, we can develop new ways to measure their ability. It's important that we do not let our twice exceptional or culturally diverse gifted learners fall through the cracks and using tools that are the most effective, such as the new composite scores that Dr. Silverman shared with us, can help us move toward that mission. Schools need to step up to support gifted learners, just like any other special needs population. And that begins with developing a robust and thorough process for identifying gifted learners. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. See you next time on Mind Matters.
We are who we are. Why don't I be me and you be you? We're spreading color around us. We're lighting up the sky, it's what we do. We shouldn't care about anyone or anything that brings us down. So come on now, let's be free. Just be yourself. Keep on doing what you do, doing what you do. Just keep on doing what you do, doing what you do, doing what you do, doing what you do, doing what you do. Do what you like, do what you like to do, do what you like, do what you like, do what you like to do.
Thanks for listening to the Mind Matters podcast with Emily Kircher-Morris. To learn more about us and our mission, go to mindmatterspodcast.com. If you'd like to show your support for Mind Matters, find us in Apple iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe and leave us a positive review. Start a discussion and follow us on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod or on Facebook at Mind Matters Podcast. Help us spread the word about the Mind Matters podcast.
Doing what you do, doing what you do. Just keep on doing what you do, doing what you do, doing what you do, what you do, doing what you do. Do what you like, do what you like to do, do what you like, do what you like, do what you like to do.
Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.